The term narcissism gets thrown around a lot these days, kind of like glitter at a pride parade, overused, seems like a good idea at the time, but the practical result and the cleanup are often, well, less than satisfying. And because that label gets applied so freely, many people have tried to explain what exactly is going on inside of the mind of a narcissist. People like Dr. Sam Vaknin and Richard Grannon have spent years trying to understand and explain how someone can appear so unrepentantly selfish, manipulative, and indifferent to the suffering they cause. And the model many people end up with is almost mythical in nature, kind of a reptilian predator in human form, a Komodo dragon stalking a lamb, biting opportunistically, then calmly waiting for the wound to fester. And the victim weakens, the predator waits, and then consumes what's left at its leisure. It's a dramatic image, and sometimes it feels disturbingly accurate. But here's the thing. Why? What creates behavior that looks so cold? Is it evil, or is it something else? Because as disturbing as that image is, the Komodo dragon isn't evil. It's just doing what a Komodo dragon does, nature following its course. Now, before anyone starts warming up their keyboard in the comments section, let me be clear. Understanding the behavior is not the same thing as excusing the behavior. A hurricane doesn't have malicious intent, but it's still destructive. And a Komodo dragon isn't morally wicked, but it is still very, very dangerous. And a narcissist can absolutely, without question, devastate lives. But understanding where a behavior comes from and excusing it are not the same thing. A friend of mine called me recently. We were catching up, talking about business, life, the usual stuff, but he was upset. His 16-month-old son had recently been forced to stop breastfeeding. His partner had developed a postpartum clotting disorder and needed medication that made continued breastfeeding impossible. So instead of gradually weaning the child like they were doing, they had to stop abruptly, and almost overnight everything changed. The calm, happy, affectionate little boy became irritable, temperamental, prone to tantrums. But that wasn't really what bothered him. What bothered him was the way the child suddenly started treating his mother, pushed her away and ignored her, accepted comfort from the dad while rejecting it from her. And my friend Dennis kept saying the same thing. It's like he hates her. What was even harder for him to watch was the mother's reaction. She was devastated, filled with guilt. She was convinced that she'd failed as a mother. And she was searching endlessly for natural remedies, speaking to friends, everything to try to find some way to stop the medication and restore that bond. As I listened to her talk, something sounded very familiar to me. And that wasn't because she was describing her son. It was because she was describing herself. She had started personalizing his behavior. He hates me. He won't come to me. I've somehow damaged our relationship. And that's when I felt the overwhelming urge to channel Cher from Moonstruck. The scene where Cher slaps Nicolas Cage across the face and yells, "Snap out of it!" Because at the end of the day, he's a baby, and he's encountering one of life's first disappointments. Now, this is where the biology nerd in me gets excited. In college, I owned a bright orange t-shirt that said, "Ontology recapitulates phylogeny," which roughly translated means I'm a virgin bio-nerd. And while it's outdated biological theory, the underlying idea points to something important. Human beings aren't born fully developed, physiologically or psychologically. The newborn arrives with basic survival circuitry online. Breathing, sucking, sleeping, crying, and of course pooping. And the higher architecture is still under construction. Empathy, impulse, control, perspective taking, identity, those are all systems that take years to develop. The roads are mapped, the grid is planned, the permits have even been approved, but the city has not yet been built. And a newborn is largely instinct, just wrapped in adorable baby fat. Now, again, before every developmental psychologist and basement philosopher starts composing an angry comment, yes, I'm taking a tremendous amount of poetic license here, but stay with me for a second. When a baby smiles at you, it recognizes your voice or reaches for comfort or cries when you leave. It doesn't mean it fully understands you as a separate person. It doesn't understand sacrifice or gratitude. It doesn't understand that mom is risking her own health to keep it alive. Its entire universe is organized around itself, and that's not because it's bad or evil, but because that's where development starts. It is in many ways the embodiment of selfishness, and yet we don't call a baby a narcissist. Why? Because we understand the context. We understand the developmental limitations, and we understand that selfishness is not the same thing as pathology. And maybe that's where our modern conversations about narcissism sometimes get confused, because people often speak as if selfishness, narcissistic traits, and narcissistic personality disorder are all the same thing, and they are. They're related, but they're not identical. A selfish act doesn't make someone a narcissist, and A selfish trait doesn't necessarily mean a personality disorder. And consequently, a personality disorder doesn't automatically mean a person is consciously plotting your destruction. Sometimes what looks like hatred isn't hatred. What looks like cruelty isn't personal. Sometimes what looks like rejection is simply a person responding to the loss of something they found rewarding, regulating, comforting, or useful. And that doesn't make the behavior acceptable. Let me clear, it only makes it hopefully a little more understandable. And understanding something is often the first step towards stopping yourself from carrying that responsibility for motives that were never actually about you. The mother in the story wasn't suffering because her son hated her. She's suffering because she believed he hated her. She felt he hated her. And those are not the same things. And many survivors of narcissistic relationships spend years carrying that same burden, asking, why did they do this to me? Why wasn't I enough? Why didn't they love me? When sometimes the better question is, was it ever really about me in the first place? Maybe one of the most liberating realizations is that understanding behavior doesn't require demonizing the other person. A dragon can still be dangerous without being evil. A storm can still be destructive without being malicious. And some people may spend their entire lives relating to the world from a place far more primitive than we would like. That doesn't mean you should stay, and it definitely doesn't mean that you should tolerate abuse, because you do not owe them access to your life. But it may help you stop taking their behavior as a verdict on your own self-worth. And one final thought. We often describe children as pure, but pure and innocent are not the same thing. Children are innocent. They lack moral responsibility, but they're also profoundly self-focused, intrinsically selfish, because that's where development begins. And maybe our job as parents, teachers, mentors, adults in general is not to preserve that selfishness. It's to guide it, to nurture it, to slowly transform a universe centered entirely on self into one capable of recognizing and ultimately caring for others. Perhaps one useful way to think about narcissism is this: not as the presence of evil, but as a developmental journey that, for whatever reason, never fully arrived at its destination. And that's a little food for thought.